Hello and welcome to another micro sermon, another Red Bull kick to see us through the day. I was thinking of the 1980s the other day. You remember, big hair, electric blue clothes, Noel Edmond and his multicoloured swap shop, and just how big and brash everything was in the 80s. Very different to now, where everything is a bit corporate and a bit bland in terms of music and the pop scene. You know, Lady Gaga kind of stands out, but back in the 80s, everything was Lady Gaga. Everything was big and brash. We grew up with Adamant and Boy George, you know, real differences to today. And then thinking back as well to the technology of the time, I can remember something that was almost, it created a lot of waves in terms of technology back then, and it was very similar to sort of Twitter now in terms of pushing the legal boundaries. And it was CB radio, Citizens Band Radio, which came over from the US. And in fact it was banned originally, and it was only legalised after a lot of protests and a lot of high profile public demonstrations. And I can remember that then. That was a very exciting time. I remember my dad getting hold, just after it was legalised of course, him getting hold of a CB radio and listening over the airwaves to the crackling noises and the voices of people, and people he'd never met, people he'd never probably ever meet. But it was a bit like the internet age is now, with forums and those kind of things, and it was very interesting. And that was a time where we just moved from Wales up to Milton Keynes, and he went by, he had a call sign over CB radio, and his call sign was Welsh Exile, you know, which reflected the fact that we moved from Wales up to Milton Keynes. And where does that get us to? That gets us to something that the Bible talks about. It talks about exiles and the Hebrew nation who had been settled in Jerusalem and Israel for generation after generation. But they'd come to be taken from their land. God took them from their land forcibly against their will, and took them into captivity, into exile in Babylon. And that kind of reminded me of those early days of Milton Keynes. There's a whole generation here really in Milton Keynes who have experienced that, like me maybe, where I was taken, I mean maybe not against my will, but certainly wasn't my decision to move from Wales up to Milton Keynes. And back in those days you could walk around the town and different accents, and you'd hear people from different parts of the country, mostly from London, but a lot of people who were displaced, who were moved, who were from a different part of the country, and often if you were stuck for something to say, it'd be, oh, what part of the UK do you come from? And that was often the conversation starter. So the Bible talks about these exiles, and that's almost very prophetic for us in terms of Milton Keynes and God's plans and purposes here in MK. And I just want to read a passage, really, just a very short passage of a letter that the prophet Jeremiah wrote to those people in exile. And it starts off with some instructions as to how they should go about living when they're in exile. And I'll just read that now. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And that's Jeremiah chapter 29, a letter to the exiles. And I just want to draw out some principles that God has laid out in that chapter. And those principles are about living permanently, living deliberately where you are, making a long-lasting commitment to the place that God has carried you, and about increasing in number. We shouldn't be ashamed of proclaiming the gospel and seeking to increase the size of God's community. And it speaks as well about prayer for the city and seeking the prosperity of the city, not just in wealth terms, but in righteousness as well. And those are good principles for us today as church leaders, as communities of God, to seek those principles and seek to outlive those principles in the communities that God has carried us. Maybe not. Maybe you don't see it quite as clearly as for some of us who came to this new city of Milton Keynes in those early generations and the early years of Milton Keynes. But certainly where you live, God has moved you there. He is taking you there, and He has a plan and a purpose for you in that place. And that speaks of the uniqueness of what God has for us in Milton Keynes, and that's marvellous. So that's the end of another micro sermon, another Red Bull kick to see us through the day. So remember, abide in Him always, and go out there and be passionate for Him. God bless you. Thanks for listening.